Yes, and
Long ago.
and the author of the book Shifting Sights, also the author of a recent issue of Topos, I think, which has, I mean, that's a wonderful magazine. The English-speaking world has no equivalent to such journals on landscape. He is the professor of the Institut d'Architecture in Geneva. And he says he's a simple man, and in Switzerland, architects are landscape architects, it's not made a distinction of. And then to close the day, James Corner, Associate Professor of Architecture, Landscape Architecture at Penn, assistant to John Dixon Hunt, whose series of essays, one of which he gave here in '93, called Taking Measure of the American Landscape, I think, for me, at least pictorially, represents the sort of enormous poetic pleasure that J.B. Jackson saw in the kind of cultural landscape. We tried, and the sort of arrangements we made it impossible to have an exhibition paralleling this symposium, but James's exhibition of this material and his drawings on landscape will open at the beginning of next term. Let me introduce Georges Descombes.
I just have to push the blue one, maybe. Yes. Now I keep this image, but I would like to say that I was very interested with this discussion on aviation, airports, because this could show the limits I've seen or listened in the debate, which is everyone was talking about airport as devices, architectonic devices to be seen, or airplanes that we see or we see from the airplanes. Let me just tell you simply that when I was 16, I had the same admiration for aviation, and I became a pilot at 17. That maybe is a haptic way of experimenting aircraft, which is absolutely a more complicated thing that to be seen or see. Once you have experimented the pleasure to fly above the Alps when you are 17, you never forget what it means. It's just like a sailor. You feel, you have many sensations and fears also to get down, and so you have a tendency to not to coming down because it's a moment of mistake. Now, this landscape of Bolivia, what I have added after the first lecture today, I was not, I had not the intention to show these slides because it's always the same exotic, beautiful landscapes. But nevertheless, I put it for two reasons. First, it's obvious that something happened in between what we see that and what we see in our cities or landscapes. I think we have lost something. I don't know exactly what, but I would say a coherence. And secondly, I think these images of South America, where I am not, by the way, a tourist when I go there, but I work there. It's an Inca landscape, and I'm working on, well, they just put on this island in two words, electricity. So I propose to add to electricity their own Incaic culture. So it's electricity plus Inca, not the Soviets, but Inca. Just to, because the arrival of electricity in this very simple landscape will introduce big change, and I think we could counterpower this arrival with their own local treasures. But also, I put this picture because I think most of the things I have seen, airports or Rotterdam, which I don't never deny any quality, but seems to me very well done for us. And I don't think, I mean, us very developed industrial countries. I have my doubt of a generalization, of a possible generalization of this kind of simple or complex simplicity, or to make a piazza with earth, after all, is also something that you may do around the world. I don't think if we could export all our gadgets, and what are the consequences. Also, this slide from a park in Lancy, I have 3 more slides, and after I come to the project, is just to show that I am not, for these reasons, romantic or playing for nature against industry. I just put these concrete columns playing with trees, just to, let's say, face the equivalency for me of these 2 columns. Or I have no selection when I do a project, big or small. This is Charles Simon's work of art 20 years ago, I think, in PS1 in New York. I think this kind of artistic attitude taught me a lot about what we could get from a changing scale. Neither I have no complaint with using steel in the forest, because it's very gentle. I think in that case, in Kröller, Müller, Richard Serra, I think it's one of the most gentle, soft, or intelligent device. So nothing against industrial material. Or this is a tunnel bridge we did in Lancy, the park in Lancy. So it's just to show that I am not completely attached by an archaeological attitude or romantic. But nevertheless, when I talk the title, I read the title of this conference, The Recovery of Landscape. By the way, in 1989 or 90, Giancarlo De Carlo published The Park in Lancy. I have written it in French, of course, as you can imagine, listening at me. And I have put the title Identification d'un parc perdu, and it translated in the recovery of a lost park. And this word, recovery, was for me an enigma. It seems that I knew the word, but I didn't know exactly all the signification. And certainly I accept the medical smell of it. I consider that the landscape is ill. Not only ill, but something is ill. I also, maybe it's my poor English, but I took it as an advantage for the moment. And also, when we published this book, Shifting Sides, I would say I took again this title for this small lecture. Shifting Sides was the translation of the Italian original title, Il territorio transitivo. Transitive means that everything is moving for me. Landscape is not a static thing, of course. It's growing through plants, through interpretation. We see things that others have not seen. We don't see anymore things that were evident for other peoples. Everything, but this is very banal, but I think, and Mark Tribe already mentioned it, I think I understood it like this. Also, the landscape make us changing. So it's an active, and I think in the word recovery, there's also something like this. You can recover as an action, recover or help to something, or to be transitive. So this was indicating in Shifting Sides, this title. And this means also that I am more interested in showing the shift than with any object, any situation, than the object or the situation. What I am interested in is to found a situation, not to found, to work to found the situation, which is quite different. It's not given, it's to refine the situation, and to do something on it, which is to put in tension, I would say, simply, with a design, a form. It's not an archaeological work, it's a design work, and Peter Handke, the writer, Austrian writer, said in a book this strange sentence in French, quelque chose commença qui était déjà là, something began which was already there. And I like exactly this paradoxical sentence, that I would like to show you a project where we didn't put anything which was not there, but we began with something else, which is, after all, exactly what Alvaro Siza, I think, said when he talked about modification as the founding act of architecture, as a translation, interpretation of a context that you have to read and to do something else, which is not definite and not for, yet not forever. Now, this was it's a part of Switzerland where we have more cows than cows. I mean, I prefer cows than cows for me. I will show you something else. And this was about a special event, and I try to rush through the project now. The opportunity was given by the 700 years of the Swiss Confederation. We had plenty, you can imagine, of projects to celebrate this or to commemorate this foundation or imagination. The Swiss Confederation was never founded 700 years ago, but it's like this, you know, you invent anniversary, nothing like that. And at one moment, all the projects were shifted out. And two guys from Zurich proposed one project around the Urner See, one part of the Lac de Lucerne, to make a walk of 40 kilometers, more or less, and all the Swiss people will just go through or walk this Swiss path, and each canton, I think we have 26 in Switzerland, have to treat certain number of kilometers. I was given the 2 kilometers for Geneva, which are somewhere here, between Morschach and Brunnen. So, sorry. This is a lake. Now, of course, what is interesting that all this landscape was invented by you, by the English. Someone was saying about the change in the celebration of Alps, which were aurores, and not one moment became sublime. You had pavilion, English church, pavilion for Queen Victoria, also Wagner, Nietzsche, Ludwig II. I mean, very gentle people. They had trains. And this is the so-called birthplace of the Swiss Confederation, designed in 19th century, late 19th century, by landscape architects from ETH in Zurich, and now celebrated as the original birthplace of Switzerland, completely fabricated. From here, there is a Schiller Platte, where Schiller is, you know, it's a game play, terrain de jeu of Guillaume Tell, Willem Tell, all this. But I will come back. So all this artificial landscape, now everything has been destroyed, not in case of Berlin. It was less dramatic, in many less deaths, you know, in that case, sure. But building, for the building, the death was complete in the 70s. It was the army, by the way, who did it as an exercise. So, a few postcards, and you could mention, I mean, all this device, I mean, all this landscape. Of course, I have to go faster. And it was amazing. You had there, I mean, we have no time to go on, but believe me, it was a train. There was a golf of 11 holes. There was, I don't know, everything, tennis, church, English church, a promenade, a farm, a biological farm. This is very well, very much near from what happened in Ascona, in Monte Verita. So all this landscape was fabricated and disappeared. Now what remains are skeletons or ghosts of all this life. So when I got this, I was the only architect, and I remained the only architect for these 5 years. Talking about time, it took me 5 years. I'm very slow in designing. That's a part of my approach of time in landscape architecture. And we coordinated, or we worked with friends, and about 20 geographers, botanists, artists, masons, sailors, very high, I will show you why, and so on. So a bunch of friends, nothing else than a feeling that we had to do something there. No programmation, at least. Now, we have also, apart from the remaining on the land, on the spot, on the site, we have a lot of documentation. And we have been through. So, must be some English ancestors with shoes and a Swiss peasant barefoot. And some grids. I come back with the grids. No, you know that these people living there, look again. We were not always rich. Same here, huh? By the way, the people, the local people, the train came from Brunnen, a railway, come up to the palace, didn't stop at the village. It was a pseudo-Druidic Celt atmosphere built there. I don't know how to do. With the inscription everywhere. So really the paysage, the landscape was written, literally written. So we also collaborated, and we made a book, by the way, not to sell it, but to show that we had, because it was a special event, this celebration of the Swiss Confederation birthday, and we produced a project and a book. So the book is also the project, which is a kind of a vademecum, because it was too impossible to make clear, or we had to give hand to the people coming on the spot, because we were, you know, what was the chance of ours being there? We were given, not a lot, but some money to do things that usually you never get money to do it. That's just to lose or to spend time to try to understand and to keep very banal, ordinary things that they are usually the first thing the companies, the developers raised and then built again something to replace, but something has been lost in the meantime, I think. So this was, you know, we are around the lake, but it's a strategic road for Europe to Gotthard. This is the Pont du Diable, the Devil Bridge, very difficult on the Reuss, and this is Gotthard, and this was from the Middle Age, I think 13th century, the only way to cross the Alps. So the region was also, you know, the lake is here, and there was no road. So this Brunnen was a harbor, and they used the lake to arrive to Altorf, and then the road to the bridge I have shown you just before. This is a map from the Napoleonic War. So all the army of Suvorov and the French went through the mountains exactly where we were working. So you imagine that the complexity of I mean, for me, the soil, the ground is nothing purely technical. I mean, if you grab a bit, if you look a bit, you have there a kind of a stratification of history. It's a banality, of course, but it's less banal to work with it than to say it. So this is the harbour and the hotel, the first hotel, Park Hotel, and the Napoleon Road, built in 19th century by General Dufour, educated in Paris, École Polytechnique. And this kind of wall, I will come back after. So we decided to avoid any confusion that the project will be the road, the path. So they asked us, well, Mr. Architect, what are you going to build on this? I said, nothing. You want a Swiss path? What is the celebration? You walk together. You use your own body. You select what you see, you select when you stop, and you walk. There will be nothing else than what we found on the walk. The message was clear that we just had to, like a game, to understand or not, or to enjoy it, and nothing didactical, no écriteau, no reading things except the book, just express, just try to renew the emotion to be faced by some other things. I try to explain it. Now, the geographer show us first thing very common, that the path, the red one has a new extension of the path, that the path, all of the ways always change. So we made maps of all this changing. For many reasons, the paths were always changing. It's the idea, the common idea that one path is there forever is absolutely not the use, the peasant or the farmers, because when you walk in the humidity with water, after 1 week or 2 days, it's slipping. So they just move from 20 meters. So when you are in the forest, you have a faisceau of roads, rather one road. So we just wanted to focus it. And then we try to look where we put our feet, and you see remains of the road in that case. And as you suspect that something with a collection of water was there, so we just brush the path. Just we made reappearing what was existing at one moment. Not at all in an archaeological way, but just to show the difference. What was interesting for us was the tension between the existing and what was before. And to focus it, sometimes we have pieces lacking. So we started to add, and this was a tension, believe me, when you have this natural historian company, when you put some concrete blocks instead of granite or calcaire, they start to think that there is some tension in the project. So, but we wanted to make this contact, this not violent, but precise shift in the context. So something was there. We didn't invent to put lines where there were not stones before, but we didn't. We add when we thought it was necessary for some reason I explain after, mainly based on the orientation of the people. So this is the original road, and then when there is nothing, we go on with a line of concrete. That was a kind of trick we used. And this was always on one side only, and if it was here, we didn't put it on the other side, just as a line. Also, we can see here that the path was not where it is today. So we let it the original path, and we just brush the stones here. And now, when you walk here, you understand that something had happened with the new situation of the road. We also work with the drainage system, collection of water, organize it. By the way, the Dutch people, when they talk about their landscape, they always say that God made the world and the Dutch landscape, something like this. But I think they are. I work in this country, it's a fantastic country, but I think they overestimated themselves. Because, I mean, because the only one thing I agree is that they are under the sea, all right, below the sea. But, you know, we are fighting actually all the earth is made by man. I mean, can you think about China, Persia, Thailand, and I would say Switzerland? Everything is made by agriculture farmers. I mean, not more in Netherlands, I'm afraid. And here in Switzerland, you know, if you don't take care of water, and you have to pick up the earth and go. So I always say you are flat and we are hilly, very hilly, but we have to take every year the earth and go to the summit. It's a Sisyphus problem, the Swiss people, you know. So I think we are as artificial as you are. So we try to play with this. Now, when we found this kind of kitsch, pseudo-romantic wood and rocaille, we just get rid of this and put some other metallic device and so on, just because it was, I think, more in the esprit of this hotel we have seen. Now, also, of course, nature, not nature, I think the world is beautiful. I mean, flowers and plants, I would never change it for a virtual image. Even if I look for all the Swiss peasants, I must say that, so we took with us botanist people, friends, and we make a promenade botanique, which is in the book, and we discover beautiful things, ordinary, banal, but nevertheless that's the world, and I'm not ready to change it for a computer as long as I live, which is not very long. And you know, most of the things, now we have here a picture, what we have done with the stones. We brush the stone, I told you. We brush the forest. Here, this is the spring in 91, but in 90, we spent, I don't know, I spent 1 year on the site to control, because design about the landscape, I don't believe in working drawings. I prefer to be on the spot with some idea, precise idea. But this was, we clean all this of any déchet. So the spring, it's a bit like your bees in Schiphol. The fact to get rid of all the branches, the humus accumulated, it was a feu d'artifice, you know, fireworks the next spring. So just when we had the opening, it was, we also cleansed all these stones. And that was nothing else. And on this, I told you we had a line of stone on one side, a line, not a line, a massif of plants on the other side. We didn't want to make a kind of a corridor. And we plant trees there also. We didn't add anything, but there was one plant. I mean, we found few of this epilobe. I took 2 years before the project some green seed. We went to the botanical garden in Geneva. We made plantation for, I don't know, 20,000 of these small things. We plant there. So where we had found one plant, we put 10,000. So that was the kind of tension, but with the plants. So we didn't invent. These plants were there. Not so many, but they were there. Just to attract the attention. This is a wall, the kind of wall made by General Dufour. Very, very good, bad state. So, state of the wall, and they wanted to destroy it. So we decided not to destroy it. No reason why to destroy it, but to. I said that Charles Simons show us this There is no quartier de noblesse. There are not, for me, important objects and unimportant objects. The most banal, apparently, are also the most powerful for the project. So we decided to put on this conservation of this banal wall all the duty of, I don't know, a conservation of the Parthenon. So we came with a specialist. We really restore this wall as on which there was a painting, a sculpture, it's an engraving. Certainly someone from somewhere here, Hudson. I guess he's not a Swiss guy. And we took a long time to restore this wall. You know, the kind of wall here, the same, made by the Polytechnic. And at the end we had this saved with, I show some, we need some people sometimes to do things. And they work beautifully. And in my point of view, we can learn also the site work. And sometimes we have a surprise. So the mason, he puts that, he had a fresh mortar, so he put that to avoid the frost problem. And it's, for me, it's something like we can very well see that the wall is also a table. Sometimes the wall has a kind of belvedere, and we work also adding some, when it was destroyed, sure we found this, but not this. And we work just to add some point of view, working that time in the épaisseur, deepness, to put a bench or a table. It was so expressing what we have found is this, and do something with that, good or not. We also underline with, you know, all this serrurerie, ironmongery. We just, here there is a monument, and on this we can't see that, but it's written, c'est le plus beau pays du monde. It's the most beautiful land of the world. Written by a painter from Geneva, Calam. He came here, made some paintings, so he wrote that here. So we just put a new metal string just to underline this, to have a kind of a souligné. We found also a belvedere here, which is a point of view on this lake, existing point of view. We just embrace it for different reasons, including security. That was founded, we found this, and we put this kind of, we embrace it using a cycle, because it's not an invention, but something we found also. And we put it around the existing belvedere, with a table again. And this machine, no, we have to change. Okay. I'm very late, 5 minutes. I don't comment it because, I mean, you remember the tennis grid also. So all this is playing with a former observation and a new proposal, playing with existing or materials. So these were the people, I mean, they were part of the squad from the La Course Autour du Monde sailors, because it was highly perilous to work on it, you know. So they were used to danger. In another spot, we found a former railway track, which was going to the hotel, and another road. So at one moment, the people from the Swiss way, they come here, and they had to come here. And the engineer wanted to, we could hardly see this at that time. We had not yet brushed the path. But so we react to the idea of the engineer to make a kind of a curve around here, and we said, no, let's make a staircase. Let's use the horizontality to get from one moment to the other one, from one place to the other one. which is, so you walk here on the road, you come here, and you just go horizontally, and you suddenly are on the tracks. So it's a staircase working strangely because you walk on one step, and these steps are, again, a belvedere. So you never use it like this, but like this. And this was made for when we use a wood here. Of course, Alvar Aalto made beautiful things with this. And we have plenty of beautiful wooden houses prefabricated in the 17th century. So we use industrialized section, the 2x4, by the way, just to remind that, because we have a tendency in Switzerland to use also with a pseudo-romantism the wood. So it was a clearly industrialized touch use of the wood. And these, I'm talking about cows. I don't know if they go in your country parallel lines, but they like in our country, they are also on parallel lines, but in kind of horizontality, you know. So that was my attitude toward cows. Now, we had also artists working with us, and one of your, in my point of view, extremely interesting artist, Richard Long. So he came, he made the journey around and make a text work, what he called text work. You don't have to explain his work here. But what is interesting for me, it's that he describes the geography of the past, naming experiences, events, and so on. And what is interesting in this list is that there is no hierarchy. You know, you can have a bride, a squirrel, sound, something very banal or something sublime. And I think it was a good way to celebrate the Swiss anniversary, saying, well, you know, in our history, nothing is important, nothing is not important. So it's a kind of asking for reflection about what really decided for us and what happened really in our history in a broad sense. And doing it by walking. So that means that acting your own body, after all, something we had. So this is a list in French. And of course we were very much inspired by this brushed path, because after all, I mean, architects, or maybe landscape architects as well, as soon as they are asked to do something, they have a kind of Pavlovian reflex to add something. I think we should also do something to get rid of many things. I think, in my point of view, to brush the world is maybe more useful than to add a few comments. So we had also the same, sympathy, empathy with Long, with maps and all this experience in the world. Also an attention to the people, not only to the lines. So on, you know that. And also, I was talking, you know, it's Richard Long saying I use the round or the lines because the cycle is making the job for me. I don't invent a cycle. Nobody's going, I have invented a formula. I was a cycle. So you may use a cycle as a founded, given form. And I think that was also part of the, you know, the evidence of things. I don't want to add anecdote, you know. So if you embrace a situation by the cycle, I think nobody's arguing that it's at a nice cycle or every cycle. And you may find it as well in the, sorry for the flu, assembly, you know, very democratic, maybe very early in Switzerland, assembly of in cycle of men, not women. And he's also a kind of artist that we are used in Switzerland as a, kind of a device that we are not surprised when we meet a guy like this in Switzerland. I mean, we hardly see the artist, but it's another thing. He's also, this is I think in Nepal or anywhere, so stones and men. So that was, I'm arriving at the end, don't worry. So also this history, I mean, these are erratic block in the country, I mean in the site where we were, of course used by men for many purposes, cows here also. fountain. So, and also the cows, and like the stone. So stones and cow. And there are many, many, if by chance, or it happened that this is our path from here. And it happened, no, we are here exactly, that in the region we have plenty of the erratic block, one of the most rich erratic blocks field of the Europe, or at least Switzerland, coming from Gotthard 20,000 years ago, approximately. And we asked Carmen Perrin, an artist, to do something. So there is one consideration, maybe the geographer will argue, but a black stone goes into the ice. White stones remain on the ice. All the erratic blocks are white. If they are black, they kept the energy of the sun, and they go into the glacier. So she called her works Une pierre noire s'enfonce dans la glace. And she went, because the project if the project has part of it in history, it had also part of it in an extension of its limits. I mean, you can't understand what is going on with these stones if you don't go on the spot where they come from, 50 kilometers on the glacier Gotthard. And you see this, what happened 20,000 years ago, where there was above our site 1 kilometer of ice. Also celebrated in painting and Caspar Wolf. I mean, not this, but and you found this into the landscape now. So what she did, she just take off every vegetation on this block, giving them a new white atmosphere, just to show not the archaeological interest, but to show the shift, the movement of these blocks. They were not there. They come from other parts. So what is apparently the most stable things are of actually mobile stone, if I may say. So she was 3 or 4 blocks in the area that were just questioning the people, and this is this School of Art of Geneva, the students. Quite a lot of work to do. Now the last is about the sound. You know, we have also now talking about haptic, I mean sensation. The sounds. So you know, Max Neuhaus is an American artist working with sounds. He was a pupil of Stockhausen, but after John Cage experiences, he came into sound installation. So at one point of the path, we were in the forest. We are in the forest. So the view is absolutely not the main perception mean. It becomes a sound. But even if you are there in the forest, it seems quiet, but as soon as you want to hear something precise, you have a lot of sounds around. So there's a message in a way, the work, the installation worked. This is a path with, when it's red, it's more active. So there was a cycle here, there also, about 7 sound louder, which were diffusing a very dull gling, 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 that you could hardly listen. So each time you wanted to listen, there was a noise, a plane, a car, someone, your dog. And so it was an impossibility of a very rare moment, or maybe at night when you were alone. So, and you had this magic, because it was made by computers, and it was a moving sound also. So it's very intriguing, and of course you can dream, and I have not English words but you can imagine what it gives to children to play in the forest with sound. I mean, it's a ghost or fairy tales, of course. And this is So this is Max showing like, in a way, orchestra. People, they have a reflex where the sound must be. Now I will add just few slides. It's a peasant of a friend, because we became friends after 5 years of working there. Well, we had some things in common. The gesture or what they do is not so far from what we have. This is a contemporary picture. It's not so far from what they had 100 years ago. There are plenty of people doing things and making, in my point of view, interesting installation without knowing it or knowing it, I don't know. They cut beautifully grass, making curves, and they sometimes also make lines to go from the animals to the farm. We can also observe nature. And I will finish by this work of Richard Long, which after all did a lot, just cutting few small flowers. So he made something very precise, very gentle, with no means. This is for me a kind of ideal, the maximum of intensity with the less possible material. Thank you.
George, what do I press?
I think the blue one, here.
Oh, these two? Oh. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, last and probably least, it's me. There's a, I could, I do have a few projects I could show, but I thought in the context of this symposium, and I thought I'd try and construct an argument. A tentative and a speculative argument, but something that might make a little bit of a dent in Mark Tribe's imagination, a little bit perhaps, and certainly something that represents my position at the moment. And it should be apparent towards the end why I'm paired with Georges Descombes. So bear with me, if you will. The title of the thing is called Escaping Landscape, Recovery and Disappearance. And it's basically an argument about finding some sort of new definition for this genre that we call landscape, and arguing actually for its disappearance. Landscape lies. It lies by virtue of its surface, its gravity and horizon. There is, one speaks of the lie of the land, rising, falling, emerging, withdrawing. But landscape also lies by virtue of its fabrication, its construction, both physically and conceptually. And it is an artifact that cloaks its constructedness through veils of seemingly naturalized appearances. Landscape differs from land, then, in that it refers to a particular way of seeing, a mode of vision that is culturally conditioned and contrived as a fiction, an invention that eludes, however. Here, the lie is not of the natural world, but of the cultural imagination and its various projects. Moreover, just as the lie of landscape is conditioned by construction, we can also say that construction, in turn, is conditioned by landscape. The implications of this reciprocity between various constructions are immense, and I hope today to simply sketch out one or two pathways across what is an extremely faulted and slippery terrain. What I want to suggest is that recovering landscape entails living with lies, an inevitability, however, that one can either employ in the service of authority through what I'll call objectification, which is the prevalent tendency, I think, today, or explore the fact that it lies for its emancipatory potential, its potential to liberate ideas and matter through more imaginative lies. Lies of topography, if you will, that, while obviously constructed, somehow disappear. Let me try and argue it a bit more. About 20 miles south of Philadelphia, in a softly undulating Piedmont region of gentle hills and woodlands and meadows and horse farms, is nestled a large estate called Winterthur, once the home of Henry DuPont, a successful chemist, entrepreneur, and shareholder in the internationally significant DuPont Company. Henry DuPont, together with his heirs, acquired the property and later bought adjacent parcels of land between 1866 and 1951, at which point the estate was deeded to the Winterthur Corporation as a museum and grounds open to the public. Now, during the it seems to be a day of cows, isn't it? During the 125 years of the DuPont family's tenure, the estate evolved as a productive and pioneering estate. In particular, the DuPonts are especially interested in three quite different avocations with respect to their property. The first was scientific farming, especially the insemination and breeding of dairy herds, marked by the siting of huge barns across the land, enclosures and meadow areas across the estate. The second was gardening and horticulture, especially the collection and hybridization of plants from Europe, marked by numerous garden enclosures, underplanted woodland, and extensive potting sheds. And the third was the collection of early American decorative art, housed today by the large mansion house, now museum, at the center of the estate. Now, these activities, experimental farming, horticulture, and collecting, meant that the landscape was in a continuous state of flux, subject to modification and changing developments. Significantly, however, it might be more precise to say that it was not the landscape that was changing, but the actual events, with all of their trial and error transiency, that took place upon the land. In other words, the day-to-day activities of farming, gardening, and collecting and arranging were the first and foremost objects of attention, while the landscape was simply a staging ground, a working field occupied through labor and received mostly through everyday distraction. One might say that there was an indivisible reciprocity between land and occupation, a union wherein the landscape, while fully present, disappeared. When the estate was first opened to the public, the trustees focused their attention on the museum, and the grounds were allowed to drift into a quite marvelous state of disrepair. Visitors rarely walked further than the building's walls, but those who did venture into deeper territories found an often overgrown but magical series of places, each strangely registering traces of a previous occupation and exuding a sense of the indeterminate and the not human, a sort of wild other. This, alas, is no longer the case. During the past 10 years, a new interest in the landscape has surfaced, and the trustees have invested money into the rehabilitation, the recovery, if you will, of the grounds. Their mandate has been to restore the landscape to how Henry DuPont would have had it, to make it look a certain way as scenery. Now, one of the influences on this restoration has been the painting of a local artist called Andrew Wyeth, whose works are mostly of specific places within the Chester County region and are now housed in the nearby Brandywine Museum. Wyeth's paintings depict an often isolated and bare landscape, but one that is intimate, inhabited, and worked. There are remnants and traces of occupation in the form of fences, cut fields, small dams, trodden paths, and modest enclosures. All signs of the 20th century, cars, roads, transmission lines, electrical outlets, are carefully omitted. These images, with a powerfully nostalgic charm, continue to govern how the trustees at Winterthur see, and therefore what they demand of, the landscape. Fields that are no longer farmed or serve as pasture are now cut, and the hay bales are placed scenically across the contours for no other purpose than the visual. Views and vistas have been opened and framed with pictorial precision. Plants have been cut back into tamed and controlled form, and floral displays are choreographed to immaculately unfold from visitor weekend to visitor weekend. What has been recovered here is not the productive and invisible landscape of the DuPonts, but a strictly scenic and contrived representation, a museum landscape in which the focus of attention is no longer one's own engagement with the land, but the landscape itself, framed pictorially and made available for a price for visual consumption, and, in collusion with the local gentry's appropriation of Wyeth's paintings, the reification of regional identity. This, what I'll call retrogressive revitalization of Winterthur's landscape, the renewed attention paid to the landscape as a cultural artifact, is a highly specific and local example, one of many, that mirrors, I think, the larger recovery of landscape that has been spoken of today. Whether at Winterthur or any number of other such places, the last 10 years have witnessed a remarkable resurgence of interest in landscape, an interest that has arisen as much in everyday popular culture as it has in a variety of scholarly, professional and artistic areas, including, of course, the architectural arts. What I want to suggest in the short time is that while this recovery is to be welcomed, it is also to be viewed with a certain skepticism. In other words, the reappearance of landscape back into the cultural scene is neither innocent nor benign. It is not ideologically neutral. Moreover, landscape, when objectified, when put at a distance, is in fact something that I would argue we need to overcome, not least because of its, what I'll call its retrogressive aspects. We need instead to find ways in which landscape may indeed withdraw or disappear. Now, by this I do not mean to invoke increased levels of ignorance toward the land, especially ones of domination and excess, the sort that I think we can all agree have governed modern cultural relations to the land for the past 300 years. But to point toward a new kind of liberatory project, one where matter is emancipated and allowed to stand on its own terms rather than to be conditioned by social constructs, especially those of authority. In terms of design, then, I'm pointing toward an activity of landscape making that inventively evolves its products into what I'll call naturalized but indeterminate settings, as a kind of sublimated milieu that stand on their own terms and have a high degree of agency in the evolving of social and biological time. Now, before further elaborating, I just want to touch upon why a recovery of landscape is to be viewed with some suspicion. Recovery, of course, implies that something once lost, devalued, forgotten, or otherwise misplaced has been found again or recovered with renewed vitality. Thus, further implied are aspects of repossession, taking control, regaining health and normalcy, as in a sort of return. That we are in an architecture school speaking about a recovery of landscape invokes a renewed interest in topography, site, and context, and indicates a renewed concern for the environment as a whole. It was not so long ago that building architects drew only the plans and elevations of their buildings devoid of any topographic features, trees, or larger horizons. Today, at least in the better schools of architecture, place and context permeate not only drawings and models, but also the conceptual and material formation of the projects themselves. Buildings are today less conceived, perhaps, in terms of isolated objects and more as players within a larger territory, a territory that is increasingly becoming valued not only for its scenic and experiential dimensions, but also for its semiotic, its ecological, and even its ethical import. The land, the territory, the ecology of the earth, the passage of time, nature, it has always been there, as with all things other. but only recently has it surfaced again in creative consciousness after at least 50 years of neglect and general indifference. Now, schematically, a range of different developments in contemporary culture have contributed to this new renewed concern for landscape, including, and perhaps most significantly, an increased awareness of environmental and ecological issues, ranging from local issues of waste, pollution, and decreased diversity of habitat, to a planetary concern for ozone depletion, deforestation, extinction of species, nuclear waste, and resource depletion. Here, the landscape is the most visible expression of such atrophy. It is a barometer or a gauge of the extent of environmental decline, made all the more vivid to the cultural imagination through satellite imaging, media coverage, and the rise of various environmental activist groups. We have witnessed, for instance, during the past few years, the emergence of a range of often divergent ecologies, from preservationism to deep ecology to ecofeminism, with each view passionately concerned about this phenomena we have come to call nature. A second development during the late 20th century that has impacted our renewed concern for landscape has been the massive processes of deindustrialization that have accompanied the shift into a communication service economy. These changes have placed new stresses on both urban centers and rural areas, perhaps even collapsing their differences. And they require innovative approaches toward land use and the accommodation of multiple and often irreconcilable conflicts. Associated with these demands is an increased attachment by local communities to the visible identity of their regional landscape, largely in resistance to the increased universality of place form imposed by industrialized processes of development across global scales. At both local and national levels, then, landscape carries with it signs of a kind of cultural identity, a kind of authenticity that carries with it certain moralistic underpinnings. A third development that has been the incredible rise of tourism, at both the level of public demand and at the level of regional economic development. This has precipitated not only a renewed interest in landscape, but also, for capitalists, hedonists, and sentimentalists at least, a renewed value. Whether one speaks of theme parks, heritage districts, or scenic drives, the demand for landscape as attraction, entertainment, fantasy, and refuge situates it always in the domain of Baudrillard's hyper-real, wherein the ideal is made obscenely available and blandly actual. The emergence of land art during the 70s represents a fourth development that perhaps continues to draw renewed attention to landscape, both as venue and medium of expression, especially in ecological and temporal terms. Here, amidst the work of Smithson or Heiser, Di Maria, Christo, Morris, and Bayer, landscape is presented less as a scene for contemplation and more as an active field of physical engagement with natural processes through time. Rosalind Krauss's seminal essay on sculpture in the expanded field subsequently provoked a revisioning of disciplinary distinctions, especially between sculpture, architecture, and landscape. Associated with these events were other intellectual activities that challenged the modernist negation of landscape and nature and criticized the domineering forces of technology and expansionism. Together, these various activities have precipitated an increase in intellectual and artistic reflection upon landscape, even to the point of demanding new forms of landscape comprehension, new genre of landscape. Here, then, landscape moves away from art historical emphases and into more actively interventionist spheres of art, ecology, and cultural representation. In the last decade or so, the architectural arts have witnessed a remarkable array of drawings and projects in which landscape has figured most prominently. No longer does landscape appear to be construed as the immediate grounds around the building, whether buffer or link, but as the larger topographic and ecological characteristics of site and region. Many examples exist, ranging from the fantastic aerial drawings by Zaha Hadid, imploding tectonic fragments of buildings into immense hillsides embraced by large regional infrastructures, or the work of Rem Koolhaas, aggressively occupying extensive territories and collapsing easy distinctions between building, city, and landscape. Maybe Kipnis touched on this too. The unstable geological palimpsest of Peter Eisenman, wherein the entire crust of the Earth is tectonically engaged in the making of new territories, sites, and programs. Bernard Schumy's Parc de la Villette, with all of its associated controversy and propaganda, critically revising the nature of the park in the city and raising questions about urban social life and the events that landscape might both instigate and sustain. Other extensive urban park programs, most notably in Paris and Barcelona, as cities are scrambling to inject new social and institutional vibrancy back into their built fabric. The formal and technological inventiveness of landscape architects such as Peter Walker and Martha Schwartz, echoing the graphic vividness of modernism's formal principles. The rise of derelict and polluted land reclamation projects, from the expressive sculptural works of George Hargraves to the ecologically inventive practices of biohabitat restorationists. All these and more have each stimulated a remarkable interest in landscape design amongst the architectural community, and at the same time they have revealed the inadequacy of our capacity to deal creatively with landscape issues, thereby provoking the desperate need to invent more critical approaches toward landscape formation or landscape invention. We appear to be situated at a unique moment wherein the potential for landscape might be quarried and vigorously brought into the foreground of cultural practices, and yet, at the same time, this promise also seems to be so remote, so difficult, as if a dream. Still, it is certainly a source of optimism that landscape appears today to be in a process of general recovery. Landscape appears to be more and more significant for larger sectors of society, and its imaginative dimensions are gaining ground in both public and intellectual consciousness. Perhaps we have reason to celebrate, but perhaps we also have reason to proceed cautiously and certainly critically. What exactly do we seek to recover when we speak of landscape? The land? The biosphere, a bygone era, a national identity? In turn, what aspects of landscape subsequently remain repressed, poorly understood, or unrecognized as new grounds of possibility? It is important, at least, to understand how landscape as a historical phenomenon has previously undergone cycles of cultural indifference, followed by periods of recovery and renewal, and that these periods of recovery have typically been dark ones socially, marked by imperial and authoritative rule and or enormous social inequity. For example, landscape only appeared as the focus of attention in Chinese painting during imperialistic rule. It only became foregrounded as its own subject matter in English painting and gardening amongst an elite aristocracy. The German enthusiasm for restoring a native, non-exotic national landscape was most pronounced during the nationalistic Nazi program. The boom in American landscape architecture during the 1980s paralyzed the rise of corporate culture and its expansion into self-contained corporate parks. The American love, in fact, for wilderness areas and national parks is often associated not only with national identity and a kind of collective fantasy, but also with a kind of compensatory politics, wherein such preserves serve to compensate for the failings of larger techno-bureaucratic existence. And now, in late capitalist culture, landscape must come at a price. The price of a package tour, an entry fee, or a real estate view, or even the price of its representation in souvenirs, photographs, and advertising. Increasingly then, landscape is emerging today as a kind of fetishized commodity, whether of ideological, brackets capitalist, or compensatory, brackets blinkered moralizing import. In other words, the harmony desired from landscape too easily presents itself as a seductive screen for the masking off of actual environmental and social violence. All of the innocent idealism often associated with landscape all too often masks a more, what John Barrell calls, insidious ideological darkness. In this sense, this is from the Nazi program, sort of propaganda about the Polish landscape. In this sense, landscape is a kind of naturalizing agent, beautifully obscuring its own construction and effects. Like a mask or screen, landscape is situated as a field of signs between the retina and the world. As Raymond Williams has noted, a working country is hardly ever a landscape, a remark that leads W.J.T. Mitchell to assert that landscape must represent itself as the antithesis of land, as an ideal estate, quite independent of real estate, as a poetic property, in Emerson's phrase, rather than a material one. In other words, landscape as an idea that is so bound into the great study tours and paintings of the 17th and 18th centuries is not equivalent to land. Land is lived and worked, occupied by people who are generally distracted with their day-to-day labors, whereas landscape is positioned as a view, a contrived idea placed at a distance, presented as an object, and somehow made available for possession, consumption, and even exploitation. In this sense, to borrow Lyotard's formulation, while estrangement may well be a precondition for landscape, it is perhaps more important to recognize how landscape actually procures estrangement. It is a paradox, or perhaps more a sad irony, that for all of contemporary landscape architecture's good intentions, the discipline's contribution to things like resource management and scenic preservation and recreational design, commercial theme park design, the building of corporate parks and technological estates, has, in a sense, fostered greater estrangement, albeit powerfully veiled by that visual screen of signs invoking natural innocence and moral propriety. While the contribution of landscape architects has certainly lessened the damage that unplanned development may have exercised upon the environment, and perhaps even ameliorated the ravages of visual blight, their continual and perhaps inevitable objectification of landscape, whether it's aesthetic as images, ecological as systems, or instrumental as resources, has precipitated what I'll call a devaluation of the environment in cultural terms. Once something is labeled, named, and categorized as resource, scenic view, filtration bed, wilderness area, or ecosystem, landscape is somehow made available for mass appropriation, while at the same time becoming more and more unavailable for any deeper and more actively reciprocal form of relationship. In other words, the more landscape appears, the more it as an object is made to stand forth, then the more it is actually masking, what I'll call naturalizing, a host of imperialistic phenomena, unintentionally promoting estrangement, distance, and ultimately alienation over more productive modes of relationship. Thus, the rise of landscape, in a sense, signifies for us today increased levels of alienation and societal unrest. As Kenneth Clark has argued, quote, "The truth is that in times when the human spirit seems to have burned most brightly, the painting and the conception of landscape for its own sake did not exist and was unthinkable." Now, landscape isn't going to go away. It's too much a part of our cultural heritage, and it is fully enmeshed in our networks of communication and representation. Moreover, landscape as a social construction, an invention, or an idea is perhaps inevitable, especially given Baudrillard's formulation that the map now precedes the territory. Moreover, it is unlikely that a culture would actually desire a land without a landscape. Landscape provides an orienting and meaningful significance, a treasure of imaginative and experiential dimensions. The fact that landscape is a lie, one that can be easily appropriated by certain self-serving interests, does not necessarily mean that it is a bad or dark phenomenon. To the contrary, landscape harbors an enormous potential for creativity and freedom. Here, however, the genre of landscape is not fixed, but must be made available for new kinds of interpretation and formation. Landscape is a project. It is a medium of exchange and process, a vehicle of criticism, invention, and positive change. Perhaps then we must no longer speak of landscape as noun, as an object or scene, but as verb, as an agent of change, something that is actively operational somehow. The shift from noun to verb would mean that we no longer ask what landscape is, or even what it means, but rather what it does. Rather than considering landscape as a fixed genre, an image or place and time, it might be construed in terms of circulation, as an actively instigative medium of exchange and renewal. We have learnt from the walks of Richard Long and just now George Descombes that such a landscape would not be so much seen as engaged. Its visible aspects somehow subsumed into its fully experiential and phenomenological depths. Both the land and its occupants might then be freed from the bonds of an objectified landscape and emerged instead into invisibly evolving fields of landscape agency. As for Smithson and Goldsworthy, for example, where matter is simply put into effect through time. Landscape as a category disappears, and through its disappearance, I would argue it has a sort of emancipating effect, akin to the aesthetics of the unpresentable sublime. Part of Turner's genius was to accomplish a disappearance of landscape, paradoxically through painting, wherein the transparency of the representation is given over to a recognition of the constitutive nature of the painting itself, in terms of pigment, brushwork, canvas treatment, etc. In other words, the disappearance of which we speak is neither one of natural time nor social indifference, but is effected through a carefully constructed presentation, wherein the tectonics, if you will, of the construction is what is presented over representation. This is what I was trying to say about Adrianco. This constructed nature of withdrawal is akin to the phenomenon of the crypt, as Derrida describes the crypt. No crypt presents itself. The grounds are so disposed as to disguise and to hide, something always a body in some way, but also to disguise the act of hiding and to hide the disguise. The crypt hides as it holds. The crypt is thus not a natural place, but the striking history of an artifice, an architecture, an artifact, of a place comprehended within another, but rigorously separated from it, isolated from the general space by partitions, an enclosure, an enclave, constructing a system of partitions with the inner and outer surfaces. The cryptic enclave produces a cleft in space in the assembled system of various places. In other words, a landscape of disappearance is, by necessity, a construction, an artifice invented and made. With drawing, landscape is the invisible rendered through construction. Thus, just as landscape conditions architecture, architecture conditions landscape. This is the landscape of Georges Descombes. For example, where a place is both restructured and gracefully registered through minimal kinds of intervention. Discrete parasitical operations reveal the latent and haggard energies and forces of the place. As with Enrique Morales, the emphasis upon the tactile and the kinesthetic, or the haptic, the transitory and the intermittent, lend an indeterminate temporal nature to how one enters, engages, and receives these shifting sites. Le Corbusier's dictum that seasonal and solar rhythms be the measure of architectural space portends a dwelling firmly enmeshed within cosmic time as distinct from scenic value. And for the Suf tribesmen in the Sahara Desert, landscape, in a sense, disappears by virtue of an entire construction founded upon the invisible forces of wind and underground water currents. In a markedly more cosmopolitan manner, the landscape of disappearance is also embraced by Rem Koolhaas at Yokohama, where the emphasis is less upon a formal ground and more upon a staging of programs, events, activities, overlaps, and the transiency of social change, an ambition reflected in the development of new forms of mapping, representation, and notation. Instead of designing artificial and scenographic environments, Koolhaas deploys densely imbricated systems of elements that set in motion a whole series of artificial ecologies that in turn take on a genuine self-organizing life of their own. This is also a landscape of George Hargreaves or Peter Latz, wherein the land is ecologically programmed as a huge metabolic network to take off on its own trajectory, self-regulating through time, to privilege evolutionary processes and transmutation over visual display. These are landscapes not of objects and closed reasoning, but of incomplete and ever-evolving actants, elusively alluvial trickster grounds that continually transform in ways resistant to closure and easy representation. It is the landscape of Max Ernst, where new analogical relationships between the natural and cultural worlds are formulated, perhaps even to the point of conflation and reciprocity. Ernst and his surrealist colleagues spoke of the need to continually cultivate systems of bewilderment, to break the crust of convention, and to reveal alternative series of possibilities between things all too long considered to be disparate and irreconcilable. This is the landscape of Lévi-Strauss and the bricoleur, wherein the incomplete and the unfinished is privileged over the total determinism of design. Here there ensues a kind of not knowing and not willing, an incomplete form of operating wherein heterogeneous and isolated remnants are assembled into composite fields of multiple presences, much like the way both natural and common landscapes sediment, accumulate, and evolve over time, as in Alan's description of Berlin. In a sense, it is the landscape of nature herself, wherein the wild and indeterminate processes of life are conjured forth. This is the domain of evolutionary engagement, replete with errancy, enablement, diversification, trickery, illusion, emancipation, hybridization, escape, savagery, and threat. My own work, together with that of my students over the past few years, has been concerned with the mapping and construction of such disappearances. Sometimes I call this the wild, at other times the dispossessed. I show just a few partial images to indicate the challenge to representation that is posited by the invisible, the unfinished, and the indeterminate. Ultimately, the landscape of disappearance belongs to the desert, a place denied its place, an absent place, a non-place. As Edmund Jabes describes, you do not go into the desert to find identity, but to lose it, to lose your personality, to become anonymous. You make yourself the void, you become silence. It is very hard to live with silence. The real silence is death, and this is terrible. It is very hard in the desert. You must become more silent than the silence around you, and then something extraordinary happens. You hear silence speak. The tracks and traces of the landscape that leads nowhere are precisely those carefully measured inscriptions that succeed in conjuring up that ineffable other world that always escapes. In the nothingness of this constructed but indescribable landscape, you are no longer its hostage, nor its prospector, but its wonderfully lost and wandering traveler. Thank you.